So is your algorithm dangerous? A bit of a controversial heading. And I want to look at some real context in which this stuff is being used, because I think that helps bring out some of the questions. So the first one is risk assessment in criminal justice. And the challenge that we have with humans is this. You are a judge, you have to decide whether to grant someone bail, you have to decide how and for how long they're going to serve their sentence, or you're a parole board or a similar body, you have to decide if someone's to be released on parole. What is your question at the end of the day is, if it's bail, are they going to show up for trial? And if it's any of them, are they going to commit an offence in the meantime, or ongoing? And if so, is that an offence about which we should be particularly concerned, so violence and so forth. Now this is really hard for humans to do. Obviously there's some information you might have when trying to make these kinds of decisions. You know how many offences the person has committed already, what kinds of offences they are, but humans typically are not necessarily very good at this, and of course all of the flawed parts of human reasoning come in, all of the human biases and so forth that make people think this person's more dangerous because of how they look and so forth. So what's the solution? So one way of doing the solution, and something's becoming particularly popular in America, is the idea of, well, let's use data. Now, the first problem you've got with that solution is a lack of transparency. So the companies providing the data are private corporations selling their product to courts, to states, to various jurisdictions, and what they produce is commercial in confidence. So they're not going to tell you exactly how their risk assessment tool works. Even if they did, which they wouldn't, you're still not going to be much use to you as someone caught up in the criminal justice system in challenging the assessment it makes of you. Why? Because you can't actually test. If what you've got is something learning from data analytics, right? So learning from correlations in the data, who's turned up to court before, who's committed crimes, who's committed violent crimes and so forth, then the only way to test that is if you actually have the data on which the algorithm is working. And no one's going to give you access to that data. So even if you actually had the algorithm, the process used to draw the correlations out, you don't have the data. Even if you did, you probably don't have data analysis skills. And even if you did, hey, sometimes these things come up with surprising results that even the people who write the programs can't predict. So you've got a real sort of black box problem along multiple dimensions. So what happens in practice? And there's a really worthwhile ProPublica article on one of the products, which basically demonstrated that what you ended up with was something that was inherently racist. Not simply because, for example, and this was in the US, not simply because more African Americans are given a higher risk profile, because maybe they're more dangerous. But in fact, more African Americans had a higher probability of being given a false positive by the algorithm. Now, how can this happen? It can happen, I should say, even though the company that produced the product denied using race as one of the variables inputted into the algorithm. But it can happen because of correlation, and in some cases even because race wasn't explicitly used. So let me give you an example of how that may work. And I don't have the data because it's all black boxed, so I can't tell you if this is in fact the case. But let's think about something that might be relevant in assessing risk, educational outcomes, level of education. Potentially, in the data, those who had a higher level of education maybe are less likely to commit violent offences than those who dropped out of high school. Let's suppose that's true. Let's also suppose that educational outcomes are worse in some ethnic communities than others, often because of disadvantaged school systems and so forth, particularly in the US where schools are often funded based on local rather than national taxes. So you've got disparity there. Potentially, therefore, anything in the data about the larger population in terms of disparate, in terms of the impact of educational outcomes on violent offending, doesn't necessarily apply to the same extent to the subgroup as it applies to the general population. But if you take out the ethnicity, in fact, you might be exacerbating the extent to which the algorithm discriminates. I'm not saying that's all true. This was all completely hypothetical. I'm just saying that taking out race as a variable can make things worse as well as better. So, what to do? It was an interesting case in the US, in Wisconsin, involving a guy called Loomis. Loomis was a criminal, found guilty of a particularly heinous offence. No particular sympathy for the guy himself, but he was classified by this algorithm as being high risk. and then went on to challenge the algorithm in court all the way up to the top court in Wisconsin. And the court said that these algorithms can be used in sentencing, but only on certain bases. So it can't be the only factor you look at. You can only look, when you look at it, it should come with warnings that sort of say, you know, this is based on general data, it may not apply in a specific instance and so forth. You have to let the defendant give evidence that might counter what the algorithm would otherwise conclude, or the risk assessment tool would otherwise conclude. And it's mainly about how the sentence is served rather than severity. So basically about how long you get on parole and how long your non-parole period is. So with all of those restrictions, you could use it. Now, one of the arguments that Loomis made was an interesting one because it relates to the bias point. He said, I am male, right? And if you look at how this tool works, right, holding all the other variables the same, men will be given a higher risk score than women, particularly around violent offending, right? And therefore, the argument was, it was counter to various US constitutional protections, and I won't get into the legal side of this, but basically the idea that you're not meant to be able to discriminate in summary. The court said that, you know, essentially the court said, and this is potentially factually true, the whole point is to discriminate, right? In other words, we're trying to work out what the variables are that say what risk is. You know, in a sense, yes, men are more likely to commit violent offences than women, all else being held equal, right? So therefore, yes, it should have a higher risk score, and in fact, you can't, in a sense, get rid of that without removing the utility of the algorithm, right? The utility of the tool. You have to be able to take relevant factors into account. Gender is clearly relevant in predicting risk of violent offending, therefore, it's fine. So that was the answer on gender, at least as far as the court was concerned. But it brings up a really important question here, which is what ought to be relevant when you're deciding how someone serves a sentence, or when you're deciding whether they're eligible for parole and so forth. So one side of the argument, and this is in the literature, particularly the technical literature, is that you should be able to take into account anything that is relevant for the purpose of prediction. So going back to the gender point, if that's relevant to predict if someone's going to be a violent offender, then we should be able to take it into account. And the argument goes on, if shoe size, hence the picture, if shoe size is relevant, then we should be able to take shoe size into account. It is all about predictive accuracy. But of course, that's quite different from, and for all of human flaws, courts have traditionally worked in the past. So there is no way you could make an argument in court to a human judge, right? Oh, but we know big-footed people are more likely to commit offences, therefore this big-footed person should not get back, right? You couldn't. All of the arguments in court are based on criteria that are accepted as relevant. How many times you've committed offences, how old were you when you started offending, how severe are the offences you've already committed, have you turned up to court before when you've been on bail, and so forth. Now that might not be the full picture in terms of predictive accuracy, but it does in effect take out some of these things. So the question comes up, is prediction the only thing we want to do here? Is that all that it's about? Do we care about disparate impact against disadvantaged communities, as in the case of African Americans, as was demonstrated by ProPublica? Do we care about discrimination against people on the basis of non-historic factors like shoe size? Should that turn out to be a relevant variable, right? How do we want to make these kinds of decisions? So moving on to my next one is predictive policing. Now, whenever people talk about predictive policing, they have to put up a poster of Minority Report because it's just so cool. But essentially the idea is that predictive policing is a data-based mechanism for achieving the kind of thing you could achieve through Minority Report psychic connections with ultimate future truth, right? In other words, if we can predict the probabilities that crime might happen in particular locations, then we can send people there. Now, it's not quite as cool as like, crime about to happen in 10 minutes at this location, arrest the guy now, right? But it looks something like this. A map where you've got different small blocks where crime is, it is said, more likely to happen in those particular locations. Now, the challenge is, of course, that these algorithms rely on a variety of assumptions. So, to take the most obvious one, they assume that the data being put into the algorithm is high quality data, which is massively problematic. So if you think about crime databases, the kind of database held by New South Wales Police or any local police force, and compare that to crime reality, right, they're not going to be the same thing. Some kinds of crimes are massively underreported compared to other kinds of crimes. Where police see crimes are more likely picked up than where they don't. To take a really obvious example, certain kinds of offensive language, right, is an offence, right? You can be convicted of these things, but despite the vast amount of swearing that might indeed take place in, say, the eastern suburbs of Sydney, all of the crime offences related to offensive language occur in Indigenous communities. Because that's where, if you swear, you're going to be heard by a police officer, take that person reacting and taking you and booking you for it. So it's not an accurate reflection of reality. You've got other problems as well. They work on a particular kind of model that works for some kinds of crimes rather than others. So if you take a product like Predictive, it works on an earthquake prediction model. So what do I mean by that? I mean that earthquakes happen at a background rate in a particular location, plus they also happen when you've had an earthquake, you get aftershocks. The idea is crime's the same, right? So there's a background rate of crime in any particular location, plus if crime happens one day, higher likelihood that next day there'll be a sort of an ongoing crime. The problem is that's actually been found to be true for burglary, right? But it's not going to be very helpful for a whole bunch of other kinds of crimes. So what happens is police officers who use this kind of software focus on the crimes for which it works. It's the hammer nail problem. You have the hammer that works really well for burglary, so you use more police resources to send police to the docks, which is to stop burglary, rather than, say, the other kinds of crimes that might be going on that don't fit that pattern, say domestic violence, which might also be very prevalent, that don't get as much attention because your tool doesn't help solve it, if I can put it that way. There's a whole bunch of other assumptions as well, and I could go through these, but I'm conscious of time. Because of all of these assumptions, you'd think, okay, so what you want is an evaluation of these tools. And I should say these tools are used throughout the US and increasingly in the UK, right? So you think, where are the evaluations? In fact, when we did the research, and it's a few months ago now, but there were only 2 evaluations that were relevant, that were helpful in terms of determining are these tools effective. One of them found no difference, so randomly assigned police to one or the other system, and no
difference between what and what?
In terms of the impact on crime in particular neighbourhoods, some policed by predictive policing, some policed by regular policing, whatever that is, and in fact there was no statistically relevant difference between the change in crime rates in each of those 2 blocks or multiple blocks. The other one...
Somebody made money in one and not in the other.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Somebody made money in
Someone made money in one and not in the other, correct?
Very important difference.
Okay, there is your difference, and in fact that comes down to my second point about revenue, because the other one did find an impact and showed both that the software predicted crime and reduced crime compared to the normal. However, the authors of that study were either shareholders or founders of the company that were selling the product that they were testing. So one might indeed be sceptical in that circumstance. So there's a couple of examples. What about other applications where, I think you've got to really think about the impact these kinds of tools might have? One is university admissions. In fact, we were just having an interesting discussion at lunchtime about how this is done and how universities can make sure they're sufficiently diverse and so forth. This is the opposite of that. So the idea was, and we had speakers come to our university, IBM Watson came and gave a presentation saying, forget all this exam stuff you do to determine who gets into university. We've got data, and we can tell you who's going to succeed at university based on that very large data set in our wonderful Watson black box. Now, again, do we really want to shift from a test-based system to a database system? Education more broadly. My son is in high school, get pushed along particular pathways depending on how well they performed against previous ones. So more and more, it's not a human being saying, let's intervene and say where you need help. It's a computer software program saying, no, you need this pathway and not get pushed to the advanced stuff, or you get pushed to the advanced stuff and so forth. So do we trust it there, or are we also potentially worried about the impacts of that? Employment's another one, speaking about the jobs point I will wrap up. Speaking about the job point earlier, where resumes are automatically analysed, social media is automatically analysed, and that's been demonstrated that the victims of social media bullying are then unable to procure employment because of their social media profiles and the analysis and the way that works in disadvantaging them. Neutrality, the problem is no such thing. It's as meaningless in human choices as it is in machines when you actually think about it. So how do we embed ethics? And I should say, when I did technology ethics, that is the first thing that came up on Google, which I found quite interesting. So what to do for designers? What does this algorithm need to do? Does it need to do more than predict? Do we need to think about not only accuracy but also impact? And do we need to understand the assumptions? For the government, what to do? Educate everyone. This stuff should be, how these tools work should become as fundamental knowledge as how graphs work for new citizens, right? People need to understand it so they can work within a society where you're being judged by them constantly. How to maintain accountable decision making where there's challenges of transparency, and how to engage the public so that we as a community decide the extent to which our courts are using these tools, rather than it simply happening by often non-expert judges making the decision. Thank you.
Woo.